the book of Esther is fascinating for a whole number of reasons. Number one, it's one of the books of the Bible in which God is never mentioned once. God is always implied and implicit as being at work, but the Lord's name never appears in the book of Esther once. So what is it about the book of Esther that made the Jewish people included as part of the canon, which we know as the Old Testament, as part of our Bible? What is it about Esther that speaks so powerfully? And of course, this morning out of the 10 chapters, we heard just a few verses. So my task in a few minutes, I won't say it's mission impossible, but in a few minutes is to give you a little background to put this passage into context and encourage you to read the book of Esther because it is a great encouragement. Now, let me just say, you are some of the most fortunate people in the world. Do you know why? You exist. During the 1960s, when I was growing up, I never realized until later on, as I read about the Cuban Missile Crisis, that we were this close to nuclear annihilation. And as years have gone on, of course, as more and more states have acquired nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, as a human race, we develop the potential to wipe out large numbers of our brothers and sisters, those created in the image of God, using these terrible weapons. And sometimes the only thing that has stopped them from being used, when you read the history, you tend to read it in broad sweeps. We think of them as large numbers of people being involved in decisions, and yet nuclear weapons, actually it's a very small number of people who have control over these devices, and it is a small number of people, the decisions they make, which prevent them from being used or allow them to be used. It's in that context in modern day when you read about the head of the president of Iran talking about the annihilation of the Jewish people, that they have no roots in the Middle East. And of course, if you have any Bible reading of all, you know the Lord's had them in the Middle East for thousands of years. But when you hear people making statements that they want to annihilate a people, and this is the same state that's alleged to be developing and probably is developing nuclear weapons, you want to pray. And you ask yourself the question, Lord, how is it that people can desire to destroy each other en masse? And of course, there are several reasons for that. The book of Esther highlights a couple of them. So let me give you a little bit of a history lesson. If you think back in the Old Testament, you'll remember the time of the United Kingdoms when Israel, North and South, were united, very much like the United States before the Civil War. And under the three kings, Saul, David, and Solomon, you had a united kingdom and a fair degree of prosperity. It's when the temple is first built, major trading, and of course Israel is located on the major trading lines between the Hittites in the north, the Assyrians and the Babylonians in the east, the great empires, and then in the south, in the Nile Delta, of course, we have Egypt, and in between we have Israel. And so everyone coveted controlling Israel because of taxes. Isn't it to know some things never change? Taxes equal money, money equals power, states desire them. When taxes, of course, are used for the benefit of the people, they're very productive. But when taxes are used in a way that is inappropriate, often people become very wealthy and many people remain very poor. Now, during the United Kingdom, under Solomon, David, and Saul, they were able to collect taxes in Israel and have control over their territory. And so the kingdoms, actually, particularly Solomon, became noted not only for his wisdom, but also for the economic power of Israel at that time. Now, between these great, Israel, as I mentioned, between these great empires, so they're always fighting over control of who controls Israel because of the trade routes. Egyptians, Hittites, Assyrians, and Babylonians. Those are the four major players in this discussion. When disunity takes place and the northern kingdom of Israel splits from the south, and the north begins to chase after false gods, eventually the northern kingdom is destroyed by one of the eastern empires, and the people taken into captivity. Sometime later, the southern kingdom also falls, and the people are taken into captivity. Some of you may remember that great song by Boney M., By the Rivers of Babylon, We sat down and yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. Of course, that's a quote of the psalm. But what they're referring to, the Jewish people as they're taken into exile in Assyria and Babylonia are asking the question, how can we worship God in the midst of a culture which doesn't know God when we've lost our roots, our identity, no more temple in Jerusalem? God, where are you? It seems like you've abandoned us, and it seems like history is just rolling on just as an object of our own accomplishments and desires. And they were feeling lost and abandoned. Now, this is not a new, this is a new practice as well as an ancient one. I happened to be in Lhasa in Tibet a number of years ago, and the Chinese had just finished building the railway. Previous to that, you had to hike in or take a very long road transport, which was closed generally during the winter, but the rail route was just being completed. The Chinese government, of course, wanted to bring reliable citizens, Han Chinese, in great numbers in Tibet in order to control the population. That was already starting to take place, and the railway allows them to bring many, many people in very less expensively than flying them in. And so empires have used the principle of taking people from one part of the empire and putting them in another part where they don't know people, or bringing some people who are loyal into an area that's considered disloyal as a way to control it. It's ancient, but it's also a modern practice. This is what happened to the children of Israel in the southern kingdom. They're transported into Babylon, and they're asking the question, God, where are you? Are you at work in history? How can you save us and redeem us? Of course, as we read the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, we read of the king who decides to allow them to come back, rebuild the city walls, and begin the rebuilding of the temple. But that's not yet. And during this story of Esther, we read of an orphan who God uses to make her into a queen and save her people. And that's the heart of the book of Esther. Now, I won't go into all the details of the 10 chapters, but let me just say, this has everything in it. Sex, violence, revenge, anger, drunkenness, you've got it. It's there. So those people who say the Bible is boring, you haven't read it. So, for example, at the beginning of the book of Esther, for those of you who think you know how to party, the ancients had it over you by far. For example, in the opening chapters of Esther, the king has a 7-day feast. That's another way of saying he was drinking for 7 days with his buddies. And at the end of it, they make some decisions. And here's the decision the guy makes. He was so hammered that he says, I just to prove to all of you how beautiful and how powerful I am, and therefore, because of my power, I'm able to attract women of great beauty and hold them as part of my large number of wives. He says he commands his wife to appear before him in the crowd wearing only her crown. Now, for those of you who believe in women's rights, amen? Do you know what she says? Here's a woman with guts. She says, no, I won't be subjective to shame in front of people in this way. And in spite of the fact it means losing her position. But there's a woman of great courage, I think. But here's a man, you see, who's used to being the supreme ruler over all. His word is law. His word means life or death. And can you imagine the ego that develops within you? The second characteristic of the kings at this time, Xerxes perhaps in history, is that they became exceptionally paranoid. There were always plots to assassinate the king or the ruler. And so with all of these plots going, can you imagine having a giant ego where you have life and death over everyone, where you're the most powerful, richest person, where your word is life or death, and at the same time, you're paranoid, people are trying to kill you all the time. Those two things in combination, very scary. Can you imagine being in the court where every word and the thing that you do could be misinterpreted? Can you imagine misspeaking at the court and the king just goes, you're gone? What a terrible place to be. So here's what's going on. There is a fellow named Mordecai. He's a Jewish ancestor of those transported into captivity. He's one of the advisors to the king. He's also strongly disliked by another fellow in court called Haman. And doesn't this sound familiar? Two people with conflicts who dislike each other, and they're trying to destroy each other. It plays out very much today in so many different situations. And Haman, because he's a higher advisor, says to the king, "King, as a sign of how powerful you are, I'd like you to issue a decree that everyone in the entire kingdom should bow down before me as well as you." Can you imagine the size of that ego? Every time he walks around, if it were me, I'd be walking around, you'd be all on your hands and knees bowing down. That's essentially the order. Everywhere he walked, he expected that to happen. However, Mordecai, because he is a Jew, promises to bow down before no one except God. And this drives Haman crazy with anger and envy. Everyone else bows down, but not Mordecai. And so Haman decides that he's going to destroy not only Mordecai, he's going to destroy Mordecai's family and his whole tribe. Now, within the context of the Persian Empire at this time, it was made up of literally hundreds of different ethnic groups, and they were in competition with each other all the time. And so people often thought of extermination, not just of the individual, but their entire family and clan and group, as a way to prevent them getting revenge. That theme still plays out quite widely in the Middle East today. And if you want to think of Syria and some other places in that context, it gives you some insight. And so Haman goes before the king, catching him in one of those moments where he says, "King, there is one person who has not obeyed your order. His name is Mordecai. I want you to issue a decree that on a certain day, he's going to be executed, but you're also going to destroy his people, the entire Jewish people throughout the empire." The king agrees because he sees it as an affront to his power. And so the story continues. And we have Esther at the same time. So how does she come in? She's an orphan. She's adopted into the family of Mordecai, who looks after her. She is exceptionally beautiful, and as the king had gotten rid of one of his previous wives, he goes to hold a Who Wants to Marry a Millionaire competition. He invites the most beautiful women from the empire to come forward and be judged. Esther is one of those who's selected, and she is chosen to be the new queen. But this puts her in a very difficult position because on one hand, she has gone from orphan, a person with no power, to being the queen, a person with a great influence and power, but has a problem. You can only come before the king if you were invited by the king. This was a way of really controlling access to the person of power in the kingdom. And so Esther is asked by Mordecai, when he finds out that the Jewish people are to be destroyed, to find a way to come before the king to beg his forgiveness and ask for the order to be rescinded. And so she is faced with a moral quandary. Do I say nothing and perhaps survive? Or do I step out in faith and trust that God is going to watch over me and I can do this great thing, risking my life? I was 2 summers ago in Amsterdam, and one of the places I wanted to visit was the house of Anne Frank. It's quite a moving situation. If you've read the book, you know her story. But her story of being hidden, and of course, if you've read the book The Hiding Place, you also read of families who in Amsterdam literally gave their lives because they were often arrested if they were caught when informers turned them in. The families hiding Jews were also arrested and taken to the concentration camps. And so we have these stories of people who made the decision, do I stay silent while others are persecuted, or do I do something about it? It's that moment of choice. And Esther steps forward in faith and comes forward with an interesting idea. She risks life and death by going to the king uninvited and invites him to come for a banquet, a meal. You know, my mother was quite right. What's the way to a man's heart? It's true. It's true. And of course, this is true in ancient times. So the king comes for a special banquet, and during that time, Esther takes great courage and asks him to set aside his previous order that the Jews are to be wiped out and can't defend themselves. So that's essentially the story of Esther, and Haman comes to a bad end, and Mordecai has a positive future. But what does this story say to us, and why was it included in the canon of the Old Testament? First of all, Esther is someone who rises from nothing, the weakest person in society, an orphan, to become queen. And God is working very much in her life, and she decides to step out in faith. In other words, God puts each of us in a place in our workplace, where we live with our families, to be an influence for Him and to be faithful and obedient. And it may be in the smallest things, but it can have a huge impact. The second thing about this book, which is very interesting, is that the king, even though he is not, doesn't worship God, would be considered as someone who would be a seeker, doesn't realize it, but God is using him to make decisions which will benefit the people of God. In other words, God is very much at work in our lives even before we choose to recognize that He is. Why? Because He loves us. And in a time when people are exceptionally skeptical in our day and saying, where is God? We don't need to worship God. We need to just have a secular culture. Your worship is only a private thing. The book of Esther reminds us that, in fact, that's false. God is woven into the very history, day by day by day, and is at work, even in the lives of those who have not come to see that He is there and very real. God's love for us is eternal because He created us and knows us and wants to draw us into relationship with Him. The book of Esther, 10 chapters of dynamite. Read it. Amen.